Okay, I think we're enough of a critical mass where I could start. Hi, everybody. My name is Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And it's my pleasure today to be with you and with Zahed Amanullah, who's I first met at a conference a few months ago at what was called Define American. It was a group that was focused on making positive stories of immigrants to try to push back on some of the nativist ideas in America today. And I hosted a session in which the head was a presenter, and I was very fascinated with what he presented in terms of not only what he was seeing online, but some of the things that were actually having a counter speech effect in his community. And I learned a new term there that I thought was important that I had not heard before, as opposed to debunking things, to pre-bunk things, and how do you deal with misinformation and so forth. But the whole world of online hate is a fascinating one on itself. And Zahed and I were talking about a variety of projects, including one that we're working on at the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And then we were, of course, emailing right after October 7th. And I was so impressed with the work that his group was doing and that he was putting out that I knew we had to have him in front of this audience. So it's my pleasure to have him here today. Let me give you a brief introduction. Then I'll turn it over to Zahed, and he'll speak for probably about 40 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. You don't have to wait until the end if you want to populate some questions into the Q&A. Feel free to do that, and then I will disappear during his presentation and pop back in and pose the questions to him. So Zahed Amanullah is a senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where he plays a pivotal role in leading programs focused on civil society engagement, communications, and partnerships. He spearheads the Institute's research and initiatives in areas including artificial intelligence, counterspeech, and addressing Islamophobia. He has forged extensive collaborations with entities like Google.org and various foundations, working to provide crucial support to civil society organizations in the UK and Europe in their efforts to combat various forms of offline and online harms. He has testified before the UK and European parliaments on digital policy matters and has been featured in prominent media outlets, including the BBC, NPR, Channel 4, Sky News, The Guardian, CNN, The New York Times, and leading podcast. He previously served as the director of the Concordia Forum, a global network of Muslim leaders from 2011 to 2022. I'm delighted to have him speak with us today about Islamophobia and anti-Semitic discourse on social media following the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. Zahed, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thanks to all of you who are joining us. I'm really, really honored to be here. I'm really a big admirer of Ken's work, and I think, some of the discussions that we've had both before and after October 7th really has helped galvanize my thinking on how to address this huge challenge that we have before us. I'm going to talk a little bit today. Hold on, I'm going to just share my screen, so apologies. Hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some research that we did right at the time of the October 7th Hamas attacks, and how we did it, what we found out, and why it's important. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about ourselves. As Ken mentioned, I'm from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. We're a global think tank that's leading the way in countering hate, polarization, and disinformation. We produce action-oriented research, which is research that is intended to drive policy or initiatives that will help counter hate and disinformation effectively and efficiently. We do policy advisory to governments and international bodies like GIFCT and the Christchurch Call. We provide training on disinformation and digital literacy for schools and the workplace. We provide toolkits for civil society to build resilience through campaigns. That's where Ken heard of some of my work in the last time I spoke on a panel with him. We have networks of youth and cities and practitioners to help scale up and amplify the outcomes. And we have staff in 4 regional offices: Berlin, Washington, London, where I am, and Amman, Jordan, with over 140 staff. So we're quite a comprehensive organization, and we are very much geared toward trying to address trends as they happen. And so this is just a snapshot of what we do. We have a digital analysis unit, which was the part of our organization that drove the research that I'm going to tell you about. And through our other partnerships with tech companies and with practitioners and others, we try to scale all this up. So leaving that pitch aside, I'll go into the research that we did. So after October 7th, we produced 2 research briefings, one on anti-Semitism and one on anti-Muslim hatred. Enough of us had been studying these conflicts in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine over the years to know that both of these issues would be worth analyzing in a very objective and efficient way. The anti-Semitism briefing that we produced by my colleagues Hannah, Jakob, and Milo, plus our partners at an organization called Chasm Technology, the Center for Analysis of Social Media, based in London. We have an ongoing partnership with them and software that we developed called Beam. You can see the logo for it there. This is the methodology and the software that we use to capture sentiment analysis, and at any given time on any number of platforms, and try to get workable, analysis from that. We produced an anti-Semitism briefing first, just as simply a matter of bandwidth in producing the analysis. That was produced a few weeks ago, and we just published our anti-Muslim hatred briefing on the same analysis yesterday, which is why I'm kind of exhausted having to have worked on that and then having to work on this presentation. But again, the timeliness, it's really important that this gets out so that people can see why these issues matter. Because the next time we'll be talking about this could be 6-7 weeks into January, and who knows how the landscape will change. But at least we have a baseline, and that was the intent of this research, is to provide a baseline. What happened immediately before and in the couple of weeks after October 7th? What do those spikes indicate in the way that people reacted in both of these targeted hate areas? So I mentioned that this Beam collaboration between ISD and Chasm. It's a multilingual, multi-platform capability designed to expose and track and confront information threats online. And what we did is we spent a lot of time using our analysis capabilities to track the communications of extremist groups. But this time we were more interested in capturing the sentiments of the public at large. Because obviously everyone was glued to their screens to see what was happening. Tensions were being raised. We used YouTube, and we collected videos using the YouTube API from the 4th of October, so that's 3 days before the attacks, to the 12th of October, and in some cases after that, using a combination of keywords relative to the conflict and comments from the relevant videos that we scraped. In order to do this, we had to establish a baseline for both of these. When we're using classifiers for both of these issues, we had to develop these classifiers with an understanding of what these issues were. And to do that, we had to look at the definitions that have been produced for both of these issues and use our own judgment as analysts to tweak them as necessary if we felt that they weren't going to produce results that we thought were 100% accurate. But as a baseline, we use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. Of course, Ken's a co-author of that. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we understood when we were analyzing this is, in addition to the conventional tropes, we were looking at comments that conflated Jews worldwide with the actions of the Israeli government vis-a-vis this conflict. Because as I'll explain as we proceed, a lot of the anti-Semitism was linked very, very closely to those actions. We have a page on anti-Semitism on our website. You can see more information there. For the Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred one, we looked at a number of definitions that were existing. A lot of those developed here in the UK, originally by the Runnymede Trust in 1998, but then further developed by a set of parliamentarians in the British Parliament, the APBG British Muslims. They produced a working definition of Islamophobia that was adopted by every political party in the UK except for the ruling Conservative Party. And so I myself gave evidence in Parliament for that definition. So we used that also as a baseline, although we again looked at it within the lens of this conflict, and in parallel with what we've seen with anti-Semitism, we're looking at comments that conflated Muslims worldwide with the actions of Hamas. And again, we're talking about the October 7th attack in particular, which was the crux of the anti-Muslim sentiment that came out in the week that followed. You'll notice I'm using two words, Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. We have seen those words being used, and for our purposes, we're using both words just in case people have a preference for one or the other. But really, what we're talking about is something that we're considering essentially the same thing. I know there are differences in that. That's an academic discussion, but we kind of, by doing this, we want to put that academic discussion just aside and understand that we're talking about comments that are marginalizing Muslims. Obviously, these joint threats, it shouldn't be news to many of you. You can see by stories in the news how many people, not just us, have noticed the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. And again, you can see those terms also being used interchangeably in these news stories. You can see it in Canada, Australia, the UK, the EU, all over the US, in universities and workplaces. It is, this we've all heard of the anecdotes of anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Muslim attacks, including people being assaulted or even killed. I'm not going to put together a list of all those. The purpose of this presentation is solely our online research, but you can of course view it in the context of very real on the ground sentiments, definitely on college campuses, as Ken would probably attest to. So this is not in a vacuum that we're talking about these two things together. And often, outside of these news articles, when it comes to research, we see very little research which analyzes these side by side. We see a lot of research that analyzes one or the other. It was our intention to try to do it jointly in order to see if there are lessons that we can learn or even correlations between the two. We're not trying to both sides this. We're not trying to make it a contest between the two types of hate about who's hated more. There's enough pain in this conflict to go around, and there's no need to sort of sensationalize it. This is just simply that snapshot of on the ground incidences in roughly the same time frame that we did our analysis. So when we're tracking our analysis, which as I'll show you, peaked around October 13th, you can see that a parallel of offline incidences that's peaked around that same time. So the lesson, of course, from that is that online incitement can lead to offline harm. So let's start with anti-Semitism online post October 7th. So what we did is we produced a bespoke anti-Semitism classifier trained by domain experts against conflict-related manifestations of anti-Semitism and the IRA definition. In our provisional analysis on YouTube, we discovered over 15,000 English language anti-Semitic comments on videos about Israel and Palestine in the week following the attacks. Compared to 3 days before and after the attack, this constituted a 50-fold rise in anti-Semitic content, again, according to the IRA definition, as well as 2.4 times increase in the overall proportion of anti-Semitic comments compared to the overall comments that existed. Here's now the interesting slide that characterizes those results. We coded the comments against a broad range of anti-Semitic tropes, and we used our analysis to determine which categories those comments existed, and we also did a manual check on that as well. By far, the largest trope that was said in these comments was adopting conspiratorial tropes about Jewish power. You can see down the list, classical anti-Semitism, called for the killing of Jews, 12% comparisons between Israel and Nazi Germany, and down the list. This is interesting because if you were to look at anti-Semitism, I guess in the year previous before this conflict, you wouldn't see this kind of stratification. I don't have the exact numbers, because we didn't do a particular control study before this, but it, having this kind of tilt was unusual, and of course it seems understandable, linked to the attack of the sentiments that were raised following October 7th. Examples of comments from the most common anti-Semitic themes were, again, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories commonly refer to Jewish financial or political greed. Classic anti-Semitic tropes were myths about Judaism and its its history. Of course, many posts overtly called for violence against Jewish people or called for the destruction of Israel. This is another interesting bit that we found, is that despite the debates around the thresholds between anti-Israel and anti-Semitic narratives, the Israel-related anti-Semitism, the ones that were challenging Israel's right to exist and that sort of, was actually a minority in the data set. It was much more geared toward Jews as a people. So that was something that was not expected. Here's a graph, again, showing the proportion of anti-Semitic comments plotted against the absolute number of anti-Semitic content. So we're talking about, again, you can see the numbers peaking around the 10th or 11th of October, and the proportion of anti-Semitic comments of all comments also having a similar rise, 0.4 of all the comments that we scraped before getting the ones that were in our classifiers. We looked at anti-Semitic keywords on different alternative social media platforms as well, and saw similar spikes. Not all platforms. You can see the ones that really were predominant were on 4chan, but also other ones on Gab and so forth. So these are some explicit examples of some of the comments for the themes that we discussed. I'm not going to read them all to you. You can go ahead and see them, but again, they're tropes about greed, conspiracy theories, different types of conspiracy theories, or 9/11 or false flags, calls for violence against Jews by extremist groups. These are, from IS to and so forth. And then, of course, the comparisons with Nazi Germany. So that's just that in a nutshell. And there's a lot more to it, but in the interest of time, I just need to move forward. These are linked on our website, and I'll share links to those to go into more detail about our methodology and about some of the details of some of the comments and more graphical analysis. So I want to just go quickly into the anti-Muslim hatred part of this. This is also, again, a very similar methodology that we use to the anti-Semitism one, trained by domain experts against the conflict-related manifestations of Islamophobia and checked against definitions of Islamophobia, mostly the APBG one, but others as well. We discovered 48,000 English language anti-Muslim comments on videos. So actually, quantitatively more. Comparing 3 days before the attack, this constitutes a 43 times rise, 43 times. The anti-Semitism, if you remember, is 50 times. So there are sharp spikes. I mean, when you consider the quantity, fairly equitable, but still alarmingly high anti-Muslim content, as well as an 8 times increase in the overall proportion of anti-Muslim comments. For anti-Semitism, it was lower, but again, the anti-Semitism had a higher actual rise, but a lower overall proportion. Anti-Muslim content, a lower rise, but a higher proportion in the overall number of comments. So this is a little bit more of a description about the classifier. This is the report that I wrote, so I've got a little bit more detail. This is, in order to produce this preliminary analysis, we took message clusters of 500 posts or more, analyzed them with our subject matter experts, our team, and categorized them to a number of themes common to anti-Muslim narratives. The 26 message clusters consist of over 48,000 comments. That's out of 115,000 comments scraped on the keywords themselves. And then from these came the different themes, which I'll go into, but a lot of the one that was the most common was portraying Islam as a justification for terrorism, hate, and killing. And those were nearly half of the comments were on that theme. But other themes were kind of the sort of classic Islamophobic themes: propensity to lie, the anti-Semitic nature of the religion, people using dehumanizing language toward Muslims, and and how they're characterized, which is similar to a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric in Europe, and of course assertions that they were violent and misogynistic. So this is the correlation to the breakdown that we saw for anti-Semitism. Of the nearly 50,000 Muslim YouTube comments coded, 42% were promoting terror, killing, hate, and violence, that characterizing Islam that way. That was compared to the 39% that was the largest category in anti-Semitism that was alleging power and greed amongst Jews. And then we can go down the list. We see other tropes: 15% for dehumanizing or subjugating others, 12% talking about this trope about lying or taqiyya, 12% just the religion itself, and of course, everything associated with it being evil. The one thing that was interesting in this study that I have found in other studies, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, was the approximately 8% that we saw that were related to Hindutva, the Hindu extremist movements in India, which of course are in conflict with their Muslim, fellow citizens. And we could tell this from language cues in the comments. These weren't geolocated, but we could tell by the references to the comparative references between Israel and India, or between or using Hindi words and things like that. So that was a very interesting aspect that we have seen now. We've seen repeated in many instances where we have looked at anti-Muslim sentiment online, and how that is being essentially co-opted by those involved in the conflict far away. There are other tropes about anti-Semitism and misogyny in there as well. The one thing that is not tracked in this, of course, is the role of state actors. And that's, by looking at comments on a public platform in the immediate aftermath of an event like October 7th, we're minimizing the potential role of state actors. It is a very organic, instant snapshot. So we have a very high, confidence that none of these are being influenced or amplified or what have you by state actors. Now that we're several weeks into the conflict, that certainly may be the case, and we're doing studies to see if that is indeed happening. But the important thing about capturing the status on the day is to make sure that you're getting an organic assessment of what the masses think as they've been watching the conflict unfold. So, in fact, you can even see that, or as with anti-Semitism, a lot of the anti-Muslim comments are peaking around the 13th of October, and they haven't come down to their pre-October 7th level, and we're tracking this still, but they're still high, but they're not at their peak. And that peak, I'll talk a little bit about it in the next slide, but that peak centered around a specific day. I think it was right before the invasion of Gaza, when Hamas called for a day of rage, and anti-Muslim commenters turned it into calling for a day of jihad, and raised the specter of threat of Muslim communities in their midst. And there was a lot of talk about violent reprisals and so forth. That turns out to be the peak of when all these comments took place. This graph is just showing the portion of cumulative anti-Muslim comments per cumulative number of videos, and you can see that again it tapers off after the 13th, 15th, 17th. It's still again very high, but it's not continuing to rise. These are some examples of comments for the most common anti-Muslim themes. Islam as a neighbor of terrorism. Islam as a blueprint for global conquest. Islam is inherently anti-Semitic. The use of genocidal language against Muslims. And I mentioned before this trope about Muslims being taught to or allow or encouraged by the religion to lie. We did a parallel study, while we were, because this study, the study that I just mentioned, the two parallel ones were done on YouTube. We decided to do a parallel keyword-based study on X to see if we could correlate some of these findings. And we indeed did. We again saw that peak on the 13th of October, that day of rage, which became a day of jihad, and a lot of incitement that followed. Keyword studies are, of course, probably the more cruder of the studies. They're hashtag based, but we did a manual, search for these posts, and we did find that they were catching a very high number of anti-Muslim sentiment reactions, and whereas in many cases those hashtags might have an equal number of pro and con as people use them to gain attention or to game the hashtag. But we did see, like, particularly hashtags used by the far right and others rose 132% in those 10 days that followed. Again, I'll just throw in the alt tech platforms just to show what was happening with anti-Muslim hate speech. The same kind of words, phrases, and hashtags. 4chan, again, as with anti-Semitism, was the one that was most. These were most prevalent. Less so on others, and I apologize, these graphs aren't 100% they don't 100% look the same. I think it's because of the y-axis, but they roughly correlate. So I've only got a few more minutes, and I wanted to just talk about some quick observations from both of these studies. These are my observations. We had the quantitative data. Wanted to make some qualitative assessments. I mentioned before the particular tropes that we felt were amplified. The 4 out of 10 gravitating toward conspiratorial tropes about Jewish power, and the 4 out of 10 slightly over that gravitated toward tropes about Islam promoting terrorism, killing, hate, and violence. So it for us, that we're going to compare and contrast the use of these tropes with the use of these tropes in the non-conflict time frames before and potentially after the conflict. In general, we've seen that this war has mainstreamed both sets of hate speech. When we've done our studies of these types of incitement before, we've been doing it to track the speech of extremist groups, from far-right groups to Islamist groups and so on, neo-Nazis, etc. But a lot of the speech that we've seen, again, and the one thing we wanted to demonstrate is this migration from the extremes to common platforms expressed by common, ordinary, everyday people. And you see this manifesting itself offline, and this is not, I'm sure, not going to be news to many of you, this increased threat environment between Muslim and Jewish students and or supporters of Israel or Palestine, concerns about free speech versus aggressive campaigning that veers into hate speech. You know, we've all seen this elevate in recent weeks, and you know, again, that's not the focus of our study, but we want to note the correlation it has with what we've seen online. In the workplace, we've seen this also, concern about workplace morale, discipline, and reputation as tension between Muslim and Jewish coworkers and or Israel and Palestine supporters increases. This I know anecdotally and from conversations with now, you know, at least half a dozen companies that have been in touch with me to talk about these issues in the workplace. This brings up a whole other facet of responses that we might consider. And then this is my hypothesis looking at this data, thinking that the axis of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia may have shifted a bit. Before, we've seen as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia largely driven by far-right campaigns against globalism, nativism, and immigration. And there are times when both of these kind of campaigns would overlap, you know, between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. You'll recall the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh, you know, was driven, of course, by anti-Semitism, but there was that element of Jews are helping Muslim immigrants, you know, come to this country, and that was part of that too. But again, the common enemy was the far right. But today, I think some of the data that we've seen is showing an increasingly direct confrontation between Muslims and Jews in the public sphere over the actions of Israel and Hamas. Perhaps this is understandable given the you know, the sensitivities and the passions that people feel toward those in the region. We noticed this in some of the you know, manually looking through the comments and seeing elements of, you know, identity coming through in the comments, that they were not just coming from the far right, but they were indeed coming from people of Muslim or Jewish persuasion when they talked about the conflict. And this presents a different scenario by which we need to address both of these forms of targeted hate. So I wanted to just quickly cover the aftermath of October 7th and what were the role of governments. You know, many of these governments have increased and or harmonized their efforts at combating both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but there's still more that needs to be done. The U.S. announced a new national strategy to combat Islamophobia. They met with 5 Muslim Americans, 2 of whom I know and I've spoken to about, to reassure them about Islamophobia and to hear their concerns. You know, there are, of course, have been a lot of, you know, there is already a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism that is in place. This strategy for Islamophobia will likely reach the same kind of framework. And you know, there's more attention now in making sure that both are addressed in tandem. Canada first has appointed their first ever special representative on combating Islamophobia to complement one on anti-Semitism. The UK has announced additional funding to combat anti-Semitism, but there's none yet for anti-Muslim hatred, and there's no advisor for Islamophobia as there is for anti-Semitism. And you'll recall the definition of anti-Semitism I mentioned was adopted by all the political parties except for the ruling Conservative Party. This seems to correlate with that a little bit. And the EU has produced a coordinated position on combating anti-Muslim hatred in February, and she's going to have her work cut out for her. There are other issues with and challenges within academia and the tech industry to better understand and monitor both of these forms of targeted hate. One is the definitions, and I brought up those in the beginning of this talk, and there are still challenges and concerns with regards to existing definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the way that they're used, with regards to this conflict, the way that they're used for example, with on free speech grounds, criticizing the religion of Islam or criticizing Zionism, those sort of things. The way that these definitions are being used means that we do need to pay more attention. And if we can have broader agreement on these terms, then we'll better be able to track and monitor and confront both of these challenges. Classifications is another one. It's one thing to have a definition. It's another thing to have a way of monitoring and tracking these threats online. We produced our own classifications, but again, we're just one organization. It's very subjective. A slight shift in the classification can result in a spike or a valley in what things are recorded as anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. We think we got it pretty good, but this needs to be a conversation across the industry so we understand what it is we're looking for, and then we can track the shifts in discourse over time, and we're comparing like for like. And with regards to the industry writ large, data access, we of course scraped platforms for these comments. There's still a lot of information that we could have had access to that that we're not able to because of the way that these platforms are set up. And I'll note particularly X. We used our keyword search, but we could have used more in the pre-Elon Musk days. We need transparency from these platforms and a systems-based ecosystem of scrutiny, which is starting to take place in the EU, which has just passed legislation, the Digital Services Act, the Code of Practice on Disinformation. X is being fined on that basis, in fact, for not complying. And there's some lessons there for legislation in the U.S. and elsewhere. If we don't have this data divide will lead to an accountability gap and eventually a harms gap. If we can't track it, if we can't accurately assess it, we can't hold parties accountable, whether they're the platforms, whether they're governments, or whether they're communities, and eventually we'll have a gap in harms. Those countries and regions that are better regulated will have possibly less harms, and we'll see that if that's the case with the EU, and those that don't could have more harms. I wanted to end, if I could, on a positive note, and that is, what are the responses from civil society? I myself have been involved in interfaith for the better part of 30 years. And one of the things that, again, the findings that we found where we're seeing more conflict between Muslims and Jews means that leaders from those communities need to find ways to keep a dialogue going, to build empathy. I think it's fair to say that we're not going to have agreement on the course of the conflict, but that can't come at the expense of communities. The one that you'll see, the one on the upper right, Harrogate's religious leaders issue plea for respect. That's the community where I live. So there's my imam and the rabbi with our elected member of parliament and a Christian leader. A group agreed to sign a joint statement saying that they were not going to let the conflict overseas affect community relations. We're going to keep the doors open and have dialogue. Together for Humanity is an organization set up by Brendan Cox, whose wife was a member of parliament in the UK and murdered by a far-right extremist. He's set up an organization which is trying to depoliticize the fight against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and has already had marches and vigils in London, and has attracted a large number of celebrity endorsements. We see on local cases, Jews and Muslims taking part in tree planting. Discussing growing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That's a woman's Jewish and Muslim women's group in the UK. There's a group in Los Angeles, which actually includes some friends of mine that I grew up with, and that is doing some great work. And I will say, though, that you can see this one headline saying that some Muslim-Jewish interfaith initiatives are being strained by this war. That is true. Everything that I've seen from people that I work with to my own relationships, I've seen people very, very much polarized. And there are still slivers of hope that we can still find our way back to the table. But this has polarized everyone. And what we want to be careful to do is to not let that polarization spiral into hate, spiral into offline harm, spiral into bridges so vast that we can't find each other again. So having said that, a lot of these initiatives are showing some promise, and if we can put our faith in those, and maybe we can reduce that element of conflict between Muslim and Jewish communities as evidenced in these studies. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I think I'm just over time, but hopefully I've got time to answer your questions.
You do, and that's very much appreciated. I can't believe you went through all that so efficiently and quickly. And I encourage people. We have a bunch of questions queued up to put some more in. But I wonder if before I turn to them, the major takeaway for me, in addition to the data, is the last point, that you're seeing a lot of what you're studying as directed from one community towards another, and the needs to find ways to have communication between that, and to reduce the people going into their dogmatic tribal buckets and vilifying the other. So could you spend another minute or two talking about what you think we all ought to be doing to try to achieve that, not only online but offline?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot we can do, and I think a lot of it has to do with the language that we're using. And I'm looking at a lot of the questions, and I want to and I see a lot of questions um, going into the conflict itself. And I want to emphasize that I have strong feelings about the conflict. I think a lot of people do. The purpose of this study was not to analyze the conflict. It was to analyze the output that targeted people of the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith, independent of the conflict. Now, I know there are other words. Some people are suggesting I use other words than conflict. I'm deliberately not doing so because it's not a. It's not. It's less. We can. There are plenty of forums where people are arguing about the terminology and the political situation, which is fine. We can do that, but with regards to this study, if we understand the harms from a targeting perspective, from people who don't want to get wrapped up in the conflict, but are suffering harms because of their identity, this is something that predates the conflict, and it's going to exist well after the conflict. And I think that we need to understand that we need to find ways of mitigating that. And with the people who are affected, by people who are, that are sharing that pain in their own way, or that have strong feelings about what's happening. That there really is no other way to turn. Otherwise, we're all alone, and we're all going to suffer, independently of everyone else.
Great. Thank you for that. So let me get through some of those questions. The one is, do the authors of anti-Semitic or Islamophobic speech have any other hate? Does your data show that, or just this?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, and the thing is, if you can imagine, there's a lot to correlate. A lot of these comments had multiple types of hate, or had anti-Arab racism in it, or had but to a lot of it's subjective. We had to kind of pick the primary element of the comment, if you will, in order to categorize it. We have done, for the anti-Semitism study, we did a brief secondary review where we looked at comments that had multiple types of hate in them, and what proportion of those we didn't have time to do that for the anti-Muslim one. The data is still there. We'll have time to do that. But the short answer is nobody says only one thought. Often they cram a lot of thoughts into one comment.
Great, thank you. And related to that, do postings that equate residents of Gaza with Hamas register as Islamophobic content? For example, they voted for Hamas.
Well, this is what we tried to do carefully, right? We had to go by the definitions of, that were in front of us, right? And if the definition doesn't say, they voted for someone, right? Then we have to say that's in a political box. It's not in a religious box. So, and I know this is, it's not that cut and dry, but we had to make decisions again based on a fixed definition. Otherwise, the definition would be floating all over the place. And we wanted to use definitions that at least had some agreement, some consensus. And if those criticisms, those comments weren't looking at Muslims as a target group instead of Palestinians as a target group, then we would be talking about a different study. I'm not saying that study shouldn't be done. Of course, there are, I'll say this flatly, there are genocidal comments being made on both sides, okay? And some of that has to do with the religion of the other person, of the other group, and some of it has to do with the situation that they're in, being oppressed, being attacked, what have you. That is a separate study. That is that I'm sure that there are other people doing that. We had to, with our resources, had to focus on an analysis of agreed definitions for agreed target groups. So yeah, for our study that didn't include it, but of course, if you want to talk about war and conflict, that's a whole other thing.
Okay, thanks. Just a sort of housekeeping question. Where does your funding come from?
We are a nonprofit. We are funded by dozens and dozens of organizations, individuals. We do ad hoc work for governments and policy advisory. We deliberately have a funding structure that does not allow any one funding source to skew our independence. So, we have 5 regional offices, each of which are independently funded. So, but we have a single strategic, mission, and yeah. I mean, if you go to our Wikipedia page, you'll see, or our website, you'll see a whole list of funders.
Great. And another question is, in your survey data, a difference between the college-educated people's responses and others?
Well, if you think about the comments that we were receiving, that we were scraping, there's very little of that type of metadata in those comments. And if we wanted a quick and dirty sort of assessment of what was being said. So short answer is we could not assess that from the comments. To do that, we're talking about sophisticated polling or sophisticated surveying.
Right.
Of course, you lose something when you do that. A lot of people, if you start to get, the more detail you want to get about a respondent, the more guarded their answer will be. We were very much interested in the heat of the moment response by people with common access to a very, very widely used platform. And that's what we had to sacrifice, unfortunately. We couldn't gauge education or age or gender.
Another question, is there any data on how Russia might be using its troll farms to move the dialogue? And if yes, are you tracking it?
We have done lots of reports on Russian interference in elections and Russian interference, and we're starting to see it and track it in this conflict. But again, one of the key points is that in the 2 weeks or 3 weeks that we did our studies, it was too soon for an orchestrated state actor interference, and we wanted likely to be too short, and we wanted to make and again looking at comment fields where people don't normally apply state actor influence, we wanted to make sure that was written out of the equation. Now we are already tracking a lot of Russian and Iranian and other interference and efforts to manipulate the public discourse. You've all seen disinformation, straight up disinformation, even AI generated stuff. It's rampant around this conflict. And we're trying to track that too, but now we're in a different phase. We're not in that sort of short-term, heat of the moment phase that gives us an honest appraisal of people's opinions. Now we're in the phase that tries to create the most noise around this issue, and that's a different kind of analysis.
Another question is, you've described the importance of transparency, excuse me, and the need for an ecosystem of security. Can you describe the key features of such an ecosystem? What more precisely do you want to see the platforms required to do, and how would they be held accountable?
Well, the EU's Digital Services Act is a really great first step in this. And they also have a corresponding code of practice on disinformation, which is a set of principles that the platforms are supposed to abide by under the penalty of fines or sanctions. Now, though the Digital Service Act calls for access of researchers to data, periodic reports on compliance with their terms of service and so forth. Lots of steps have been made in order to enforce a degree of access to the platform's data in order to help assess how they're handling hate speech, disinformation, whatever on their platforms. They're required to produce transparency reports on a regular basis, revealing information they've never been forced to by law reveal in the past. So legislation is the first step. Of course, the EU's legislation only covers the EU, but the UK's online harm safety bill is following in those footsteps, and that was received royal assent this year. And anyone else who's looking at, there's a number of other parallel and legal initiatives in different states in the US and elsewhere that are looking very carefully at how that works. If that works, and then that pressure is applied equally in states around the world, the platforms, especially large platforms, will have no choice but to comply, and then we can check the efficacy of the current legislation and iterate it as we see fit.
Another question related to this is, does your work include platforms like Instagram or Facebook?
Yes, I mean, it includes those platforms as we have. I mean, again, part of it is an access issue, and not all platforms offer equal access. That's why we had to do the keyword search on X, where we were able to, we had robust access to their API before Elon Musk's takeover. But I will say that they're not all equal. We do have relationships with the tech companies, and where we can get more access if potentially, but right now in the last few years it's been getting harder, and that's as the economic landscape has been changing for tech companies, layoffs and content moderation teams and so forth. But yeah, we try to include all of the platforms. We use software and our own software and other software that does include all the platforms.
Great. So another question, and so somewhat long one. Did the stats from ADL include all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic? And also, I think it's also important to mention that a problem with stopping hate is that there are people in the Jewish community who are against anti-Semitism, but think it's okay to hate and encourage hate against all Muslims and Palestinians. And the same for people who are in the Muslim or Palestinian community who are against Islamophobia, but think it's okay to hate Jews. Do you think that this is also from people having no real contact with each other?
I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I think in my experience over the years, meeting someone of a different faith background or a different racial background, and I'm sure most of you heard this anecdotally, is the key to empathy. It's a key to building bridges. It's a key to understanding. I you know I I'll be completely honest. I mean, I believe exactly what the gentleman or whoever has commented has said, that there is, and in fact, it was one of the, again, points of this. There is Islamophobia being driven by the Jewish community, and there's anti-Semitism being driven by the Muslim community. I don't think it's not controversial to say that. It's just sad, and I think that we need to understand where our concerns and our criticisms and our understanding of of a conflict, where that starts and stops, and where our acknowledgement of people and their identity and their right to exist, it, begins. So um, let's it is a long struggle. I think, especially if this conflict continues to fester, this there is a middle ground. It's just that there's not enough strength to reach that middle ground at the moment.
Yeah, and that raises a question for me. I wonder if your data shows, people who may be clearly partisans of one side or the other, but at least in their comments make some acknowledgement of the empathy of the humanity of the others, those who may be strong pro-Palestinian proponents, but are not oblivious to the
Yeah,
brutality of what Hamas did and vice
yeah.
versa. And if you have any data on that, what does that show? People that would show
I, uh, I
empathy.
I I don't have any data on that, especially with regards to these studies. But anecdotally, I know of many people who are like that. I worked with a group here in the UK called the Forum for the Discussion of Israel and Palestine. They're a group of Jews and Muslims who get together to try to um, understand how to have dialogue about Israel and Palestine without it devolving into hate-filled diatribes. And they do that by they not just having conferences together, but they do travel to the region together. And so that's just one example. But they do exist. Together for Humanity is another example of the one I mentioned. And um, yeah, I mean, but sadly, it's not the norm. And this is why I was mentioning, for example, in workplaces, seeing people finding conflict between their Muslim and Jewish workers and colleagues. They may work together, but do they really know each other? And, when they're starting to, I mean, um, what does that entail? And can that be done in the midst of something so heated? I don't know. I think we're going to have to find answers for that. And we can't train each other out of this. We have to. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. Yeah.
Right. Okay, just a couple more questions. One, which I can answer, is the slides going to be able to be shared with us? Everybody who registered tomorrow will get a link to this presentation where the
Yeah.
slides will be there. So it'll take care of it. And once, I'm not sure I understand this question, but take of it what you will. How do you define the relationship between Palestine and Israel?
Um, I mean, me personally, I mean that this is unrelated to our data, but I I I grew up, pretty interfaith, and I grew up from a young age working and listening to people of Jewish and Christian backgrounds. And my introduction to the Israel-Palestine conflict was in university, where I learned about what was happening not from people of my faith, but people of the Jewish faith. And my sentiments about that have been rooted in what coexistence could look like from the days of the First Intifada. So now I know that there are a lot of different opinions about this, and but I was for a two-state solution before Oslo, and I know that it seems further away than ever. I know there's talk about one-state solution and so forth, but you know I'm also old enough to see what the reality looks like on the ground. I've visited Israel. I've spoken at a security conference in Israel. I visited Jerusalem. I've talked to Israelis and Palestinians there. I'm not saying this as an outsider. Um, and I think that it is really important. Visiting the region and speaking to the people in the region really does add a facet to the way that you interpret it as an outsider, in my opinion. And yeah, I mean, I was with people who uh, disagreed with me vehemently, but I did find a lot of people who felt that there was a way forward. So at the end of the day, we're all going to have to try to find where that common space is and how to make that space flourish. There's just no other way that doesn't involve a lot of pain and hurt. And it can't include exclusion. It can't include oppression. It can't include disenfranchisement. We've got to find a way to get to that space where people can you know live free and the details. Let's work on that together.
I think that's a great positive note on which to end. And I really appreciate you spending the time educating all of us on what's happening. I suspect we're going to come back to you at some other time, so you're going to keep churning out data and insights. And thank you again for spending this time with us, Zahed. It's a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you either in London or New York or someplace in between sometime soon.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ken.
again.
I
Okay,
I
and
really
thank you,
really
everybody.
appreciate it. Thank you,
My
everyone.
pleasure. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Take
Okay,
care.
bye-bye.
Bye.